Hey folks, Zach Osterman, I'm Insider Indianapolis Star, coming to you another one of our sort of, I guess, semi-weekly at this point video updates. This one obviously talking about the news that Indiana has finally named a starting quarterback. Tayven Jackson publicly declared QB1 over Brendan Sorsby. Tom Allen kind of wrapped up his opening remarks at his Monday press conference, his Monday news conference, talking about that decision and just kind of the whole process that Indiana went through to get there. I don't think anybody's super surprised by the decision itself. Maybe there's a little bit of surprise at the fact that Tom Allen kind of kept so much of this close to the vest for so long and then just decided to go ahead and get it out of the way at the beginning of a game week. But if you break down, I don't know that either of these players just kind of put clear blue water between themselves and the other. But if you looked at these first two games, Jackson got, at least by my count, 12 full drives to Sorsby's 8. He got 7 of 10, and this is not counting drives that end halves, kneel downs, and things like that. So full drives, normal time drives. Jackson got 12 over the first two games to Sorsby's 8. He got 7 to Sorsby's 3 on Friday against Indiana State. Indiana's had 8 scoring drives, 5 touchdowns, and 3 field goals through these first two games. Jackson was the quarterback for 6 of those 8. He was the quarterback for the field goal drive against Ohio State, and he was the quarterback for all 5 touchdown drives against Indiana State, including that one that was, I think it was something like 12 or 13 plays, 90 yards, just kind of a really sort of comprehensive drive, 13-play, 93-yard drive that ended with a Christian Turner touchdown run in the third quarter against Indiana State. Just kind of the sort of drive that feels like that's your offense, is my colleague Mike Nisley from the Herald Times Center, our podcast earlier today, is sort of the paradigm of your offense functioning, not explosive plays or taking advantage of penalties or tearing off huge chunks, but just good, solid, consistent football all the way down the field. Jackson was really good against Indiana State, and of course you recognize that opponent is what it is. But he was 18 of 21, 236 yards. He hasn't turned the ball over yet this year. He took a sack on Saturday. He hasn't thrown a touchdown pass, but he did have a rushing touchdown. And it has just sort of looked like, I think one thing I would say about this decision, and Tom Allen took some criticism for letting it stray into the season. I actually don't think that was the worst idea in the world ultimately. And that's one of those things that's sort of only repaid with the benefit of hindsight. But in fairness to Allen, if you can't separate your guys, then I think that, quarterback is one of the toughest positions to play in practice because you get a lot of stuff thrown at you. You're trying to absorb a lot of stuff at once. You're trying to take a game plan and put it in just in a few days and whatever else. But it's also one of the most controlled and one of the most limited insofar as basically you aren't allowed to get hit. And, programs will do it differently based on how much contact they're comfortable with their quarterback taking, when they'll blow a play dead, when they'll let it play out a little bit longer, and that sort of thing. But there is an extent to which, for all the attendant reasons, all the reasons that you or I could think of, games are a real crucible for that position in a way that you really can't replicate in practice. And from everything Tom Allen said, from everything we saw in open practice periods and scrimmage periods and things like that, it was exceptionally difficult for Indiana to separate these two quarterbacks. And actually, I would argue that I would say both have looked better through these first couple weeks than, frankly, I expected them to. Not that I didn't think they were good quarterbacks, but again, when you got them in game situations in two pretty extreme challenges, Ohio State and Indiana State, I think you saw two quarterbacks that still were able to limit some mistakes, quarterbacks that grew into their roles, quarterbacks that, two very different sort of offensive game plans, and it didn't look like either one was, terribly overwhelmed by one or the other. Again, allowing for the differences in competition and competitive level. And I just think that Jackson, as much as we can parse these things, just had that little bit more, maybe that little bit more calm, that little bit more poise, that little bit more. Tom Allen has used, I think, more than once now the word moxie when talking about Tayven Jackson. He even today, Jackson also met with the media, and this isn't the first time he's brought this experience up, but his time at Tennessee around Hendon Hooker and Joe Milton and an offense that right now is, kind of a bit of a paradigm for quarterback play. for others to follow, I think it's really interesting to, kind of hear Jackson draw on those experiences as well. And you just feel like maybe there's just that, again, that little bit more comfort, that little bit more sort of confidence in Jackson, allowing for the fact that these are both young players. These are both redshirt freshmen. Neither of them has played very much football at all at the college level. They each only had a handful of snaps and pass attempts coming into this season before, obviously, week one. And so you always knew that you were going to have to take some rough with some smooth. And I don't think either of these guys was going to guarantee you an immediate sort of, he's going to come in and immediately, he's completing 71% of his passes and averaging 298 yards and 3 touchdowns a game. I don't think that's what Indiana would expect of either of these players. But I think in what it has been, what situations it's been able to put these guys in, and I do think extending the competition through the first 2 weeks of the season has given Indiana these opportunities. Jackson has just looked that little bit better, that little bit more efficient. Again, that little bit more sort of poised or, decisive. I think just his pace and, coaches love to talk about like a player's sort of internal timer or internal clock have looked a little bit better. And I think that, if you're Indiana, yes, again, it's a little bit surprising for Tom Allen to come out and announce this when he kept so much of this quarterback sort of discussion and all the sort of narrative around it very sort of, suppressed through the spring, the summer, the preseason, everything. But it's worth saying Louisville really isn't going to have a great idea what Indiana is going to try and do this weekend either way, because we saw two so disparate sort of. I mean, Indiana rushed the ball 33 times, only threw it 21 times against Ohio State across the course of 58 or 54 total plays. They kind of flipped that on its head a little bit, or at least they were a lot more balanced. They rushed it 41 times and passed it 37 times against Indiana State across 78 total snaps. They were more prolific through the air against Indiana State, whereas they were pretty much even. They had 71 rushing yards and 82 passing yards against Ohio State. Against Indiana State, 215 rushing yards and 344 passing yards. And crucially, we really didn't see any of that option stuff. And anybody who's watched these videos, and I appreciate anyone who has, believe me, we're still trying to figure out how to make this work and sort of what works here and all that. And thank you for bearing with us. But anyone who watched one of the videos I did last week will know I made the argument that I think Indiana should keep the option stuff in the playbook. That I think that has some real value moving forward. At very least for the moment, whatever Indiana's long-term intentions with the option, Louisville can't really predict them at the moment, because Louisville would look at the Ohio State game and say, well, that's Indiana against the only Power 5 team it's played, the only FBS team it's played. They really doubled down on the option, on trying to, kind of grind out possessions and extend possessions and shrink the game. And, they were really committed to the way they were running the ball and all those different kinds of things. And then against Indiana State, we saw very little option. There was a little bit, but not very much. Not very much at all. And certainly not very much of sort of the triple concepts that we saw a lot of in the preseason and we saw a lot of against Ohio State. And so even if you have kind of told Jeff Brom here, okay, this is the guy who's going to be our starter, and Brom will be, of course, familiar with Jackson because he was at Purdue and Trace Jackson Davis was at Center Grove, Tayven Jackson was at Center Grove. That's going to be an adjustment for a lot of us, I suspect, here early on. Sorry about that. But Brom will still look at Indiana's offense and say, well, what are they going to do? Are they going to be an offense that wants him to throw it 40 times and they want to beat us through the air and they want to, get some of those sort of air raid familiar matchups on the outside, and they've got some receivers that are really coming into their own. Donovan McCulley, I think, has started the season well. Of course, Omar Cooper, 7 catches for 101 yards against Indiana State. Or Brom and his defensive staff might say, do they want to run the ball a lot? Do they want to shorten this game? Louisville may have, frankly, some advantages in speed, particularly when Louisville has the ball. So does Indiana maybe want to make time of possession a thing a little bit more so that it can keep some of those speedier playmakers from Louisville off the field and shorten the game that way? Brom is going to have to figure that out. And obviously Indiana is not going to be giving that away by any means. And I think that whether it was Jackson or Sorsby, Brom would still be facing that question because we saw both of those guys run quite a bit of that against Ohio State. Again, anyone who listens to our podcast, reads what I've written, or watched these videos last week will know I think Jackson may have been even a little bit better, just a little bit more decisive, which is crucial with the option, knowing when you're going to pitch it, when you're going to let it go, when you're going to, give it off, when you're going to pull it and tuck it and run, that kind of thing. May have been even a little bit more decisive in that, although I think it's dangerous to draw too many sort of sweeping conclusions from the Ohio State game in either direction. But it's going to be fascinating to try and figure out what Louisville is preparing for on Saturday. Louisville's going to have an extended week. They played on Thursday night. They beat Murray State comfortably. But, of course, Indiana only played one night later, so they'll have the extra day's rest as well, and game plan time and install and prep time. It's a big game for Indiana. Last word kind of on this video. It is a very important game for Indiana. If you lose it, I don't think that you have no path to 6 wins, but that suddenly probably calls into question basically just, are you ready to go on the road and get a result at Maryland or at Illinois or at Purdue? But if you can win it, then if you can win that and then not stumble against Akron, then you guarantee yourself obviously a perfect non-conference season, but at least 3 wins going into, the Maryland, the Rutgers, I guess maybe the Wisconsin, certainly the Illinois, the Michigan State, the Purdue. So you would need to find a way to basically just win 3 of those 5, or maybe, depending on how you want to see Wisconsin and how their season develops, 6 games. And I think there's also something to be said for the fact Louisville's obviously in year 1 under Jeff Brom. They've had some good moments. They won big last week against, I think it was Murray State. They also had a really impressive comeback against Georgia Tech, but the flip side was they were down by, I think, 16 points, 15 to 16 points at halftime of that game, and they'd given up 28 in the first half. So there are possibly some vulnerabilities Indiana can find there, and time will only tell us whether this is the true Louisville or maybe they've got a level up that they can go as well. But if you can win this game, it also feels like a bit of a statement in terms of talking about, going on the road to get a result against an Illinois or a Purdue or even a Maryland. So a big game for Indiana for all the reasons that we've discussed and possibly even more. Tayven Jackson will get to start at quarterback. I expect Tom Allen to stand behind him. I expect Tom Allen to let him make some mistakes and stick with him. I think the only way you'd see Brendan Sorsby in all likelihood is an injury. But it's going to be a big game, and obviously one in a stadium Jackson is very familiar with. He played there plenty with Center Grove, won a couple state titles with the Trojans. So thanks for watching. We'll end it there. We'll probably have one of these toward the end of the week, just talking about the Louisville game specifically. But between now and then, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. We'll talk to you soon.